Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Ting, let me take you back to the two questions you asked and ask you for the answers to your questions, if I might. The first was why are our borders still as open as they are? 3 points here, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that. Do you get the sense that there is a distinction between the resources and the manpower that we devote to guarding the southern borders of the United States, along the Mexican border, for example, as opposed to the resources we employ in guarding the northern border of the United States, our border with Canada? And is this a matter of policy? Is it a matter of money? And does this have implications for the ability of terrorists, for example, to cross one border more easily than the other? The second is, do you have the sense that the national security implications of border control policy have been subordinated to, let's say, drug control policy, that we're more concerned about people bringing in drugs to the country than we are about people entering the country and doing something here? And if so, is that a wrong-headed use of our resources?
Well, thank you, Commissioner. I think it's important to note that historically, Americans have always felt ambivalent about immigration law enforcement and border enforcement. I mean, obviously, we're all descendants of immigrants. We all pay tribute to our immigrant ancestors and the struggles that they went through and the hardships that they experienced. We're a nation of immigrants, and we're all proud of that. But the reality is we are not willing to take everybody in the world who would like to come to the United States, and that means you have to have a system of law enforcement so that the people who are not chosen get removed. Now, why are our borders so, just to respond to your question, I mean, obviously there's a disproportionate allocation of resources, and there always has been, to our southern border rather than our northern border. But as somebody who grew up along the northern border, I can attest that that border presents the same sort of issues that we have on the southern border. The border is largely wide open, and indeed every night, every day of the year, people cross over from Canada into the United States, and we have no idea who they are. Is it a question of resources? Well, of course it's a question of resources, but it's mainly a problem of political will. There's basically a lack of political will in this country to enforce our borders for a variety of reasons. Business interests want the borders open, and I think electoral considerations come into play, or the perceptions of tightening up the border and the electoral implications of that. But, you know, why this has just occurred to me, why are military bases allocated in the United States according to whose district is in the hands of a powerful member of Congress or a chairman of a committee? Why are bases allocated that way rather than in a way that makes sense for national security considerations? Why aren't they positioned more along our borders where they can add to our national security in that regard? No one can argue that drug enforcement is a serious national priority, but I think in the context after 9/11, we all ought to understand that immigration law enforcement and border security is part of our national security concern also.
Your second question about the enforcement of the law against employment of illegal aliens, is the bottom line answer that employment of illegal aliens in the United States has become such an integral part of our economy that it would suffer harm were we to enforce the law?
Well, again, I think it reflects the national ambivalence over illegal immigration into the United States. I reject the contention that we hear so often that illegal aliens do jobs that Americans don't want. I just think that's factually untrue. Americans are simply not willing to work at those jobs for the wages that those employers want to pay. But I say in my class, if you pay me enough, you can hire me to pick your fruit. You can hire me to clean your toilets. You just have to pay me enough. Americans just want decent wages. That's the issue. So I think it's a complete misstatement to say, as we always hear, that Americans don't want to do these jobs. Americans will do those jobs for fair wages. But obviously political considerations come to the fore. I think it's important to note that the drop-off in worksite enforcement occurred pre-9/11. It's not the case that we've simply devoted more resources to the anti-terrorist struggle, and that's why worksite enforcement has dropped off. It dropped off before 9/11.
Would you comment on Professor Martin's view of the Padilla case?
Well, I certainly agree that Padilla is the difficult case. I mean, the reality is there's, I think, a progression of concern. But I think the real cutting edge is between Hamdi and Padilla. And I don't think I'm the only one that has no problem with Hamdi. Hamdi was detained on the battlefield. If he had been detained in Afghanistan, would there even be an issue? If you detain someone in Afghanistan and keep them in Afghanistan, as there probably are people detained in that way now, is that an issue? It's become an issue only because he was brought to the United States. I don't think that should make a difference. I mean, during World War II, we brought lots of German and Italian POWs to the United States. That did not give them any more rights than they had when they were detained on the battlefield in Europe or North Africa. But the Padilla case is the most difficult case, and I don't think anyone can deny that. I do not find outrageous, as many people do, the government's assertion that the battlefield is here, that it's not limited to Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't think that's an outrageous assertion, but I appreciate very much the implications that Professor Martin and others have raised as to what the significance of that assertion leads us to. I do think that the Fourth Circuit's opinion in Hamdi was helpful. The Fourth Circuit rejected the government's assertion that there's no role for the courts to play in these cases. They said there is a role for the courts to play. We do assert jurisdiction over these cases, but it's a limited jurisdiction to whether the government is actually using the war power or not. Obviously, the executive branch has broad discretion in exercising its constitutional war power. If David Letterman is arrested for telling jokes about the First Lady and the government labels him an enemy combatant, I don't think that's an exercise of the war power, and I would rely upon the courts to step in and insert itself in that situation. So I think it is a tough issue. Is the arrest of Padilla at O'Hare Airport a legitimate exercise of the war power or not? If it is, then I think the executive branch has a strong argument that it's entitled to discretion in how war is going to be waged under the Constitution.
Is it your notion that the Fourth Circuit opinion would not allow the courts to examine the weight of evidence or look at the evidence that the executive branch is assessing and deciding whether or not to declare someone enemy combatant?
If I were on the court, I would be very reluctant to put the court in the position of second-guessing the decisions that the executive branch and military are making as to proper conduct of the war. I think it is very appropriate for the courts to ask, is this an exercise of the war power or is it something else? But if it is an exercise of the war power, do we really want the courts stepping in and saying, you know, in exercising the war power, I think I have a different opinion. You know, I think the war power should be exercised this way rather than that way. I would hope for some deference on the part of the courts to legitimate exercise of the war power by the military.
But could a court examine whether or not the war power was being exercised without examining the sufficiency or the existence or the weight of the evidence?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I would have any objection to the court wanting to have as much evidence as can be brought to its attention in making its determination as to whether this is or is not a legitimate exercise of the war power.
But as you understand the government's position in Padilla, they would object to having to bring any evidence before a judge?
I think I don't want to characterize the government's position in Padilla. Maybe David can help out here. But,
Professor Martin, can you do that?
Well, I think the government position was...
Here's an example. The president gets it into his head this afternoon that Lee Hamilton is an enemy combatant and has him arrested and put into military custody. what remedy, if any, does he have to challenge that custody, right to counsel, right to have a court review the evidence, right to talk to his family? I mean, what does he do? What's the difference? If Padilla is sound, can't they do that to Lee this afternoon?
But the government's position has been that there is no right to counsel in those circumstances. About as far as they've gone in saying there's an evidentiary inquiry is to say, look at the affidavit submitted by this Defense Department official, and essentially, I guess, absent total contradictions or idiocy in that kind of a statement, which you would never see, the courts are supposed to defer to it. That's what I think is quite disturbing. I do agree with Professor Ting that as we work out a new body of doctrine to deal with these new circumstances, there should probably be a distinction between pickups on the field of battle, and I mean something a fairly obvious battlefield like Afghanistan, and those done on U.S. territory. There is more call for deference in the battlefield situation, but certainly on U.S. soil, we can't accept a situation where suddenly every location in the country is a battlefield for purposes of allowing executive detention of anybody.
Well, if they picked up Padilla on the site of the World Trade Towers, is that a difference between World Trade Tower site in Chicago?
I would still suggest, I don't have a completely worked out system for how you define the boundaries of the battlefield, but I would still suggest even in that setting, if it involves a U.S. citizen, there should be an inquiry that goes a bit farther than the Hamdi case allowed, and that is you should allow the individual counsel and allow the individual to be heard in person on the matter, even if the ultimate test that's applied is considerably deferential to the military, to the executive authorities.
Professor El Fadl, there was an interesting article in the paper, it was either yesterday or today, that talked about the impact of the battle against terrorism on the political reactions of both the Arab community in the United States and the Jewish community in the United States, and it seemed to suggest that the Jewish community would move away from the Democrats and over towards the Republicans because of the Bush administration's support of Israel, and that the Arab community, which had been Republican in the last election, would move away from the Republican Party and towards the Democrats because of the concern over treatment of Muslims since 9/11. Putting that political context aside, is there a basis for saying that the totality of law enforcement action since 9/11 has resulted in a widespread feeling in the Muslim community in the United States, whether native or immigrant, that religious profiling is going on, that the policies are going too far, particularly the immigration detentions? And does this have an impact on the ability of our enemies abroad, whether it's Al-Qaeda or something else, to make hay?
I think, Commissioner, I think you identify exactly my concerns. I think it is it's dangerous to look at our war against terrorism as if the only relevant context is the United States, and as if the only relevant time is the moment that we live in. A couple of things. When I say that this is the war with terrorism is really a war of propaganda or communication or message, and it's really a war of moral message versus moral message. In this case, really moral message against immoral message. I don't mean it rhetorically, and I know that it's very easy to take this language as some rhetorical, dogmatic posturing, but the concrete results are felt materially and immediately and directly. Qaeda is extremely adept at emphasizing and in fact their whole instrument, their tool, is the claim of American hypocrisy. And if they concede that the United States offers its people and those who accept its way of life a good life, a moral life, they would lose the battle. So what they claim, however, is that the United States is insincere about what it says it offers humanity. So and I wish this message is emphasized for me every night as I watch the Arabic channels, the various satellite Arabic channels, because I see how, and in fact, I also do make a visit to some of the Persian channels and some of the what people in Malaysia and Indonesia are saying. I mean, satellite dishes are a wonderful thing, and maybe I have too many of them. But you see how our actions and our ideology and our practices are translating to the world, and the extent to which the world believes that, listen, when we were challenged, we caved in just like everyone else. I mean, we're not, for all our tough talk, we really, the only difference between us and a dictatorship is that a dictatorship has confronted a lot of violence and broke long before than we did, but we just have been lucky and we have not been confronted with that much violence. But if we would have, we'd have broken a long time ago. The other thing is that I come as an immigrant, as someone who grew up in a dictatorship. This talk about designating enemy combatants and the executive having this type of power, I've got to be honest with you, is sending chills down my spine. Maybe I don't understand the extent of institutional guarantees in the United States that will forever differentiate the United States from dictatorships in the world. But my experience in life is that human beings gravitate towards oligarchy and despotism very, very easily, and they often do it with the best claims and best intentions. And the story of success that I read in American history is a story of restraint on the executive, not a story of deference to the executive. That's the story that we spent time studying in law school. If it was a story of deference to the executive, it would be a very short law class. It would be wrapped up in 1 week.
Of course, if you accept the notion that everything is relative and that nothing is absolute, can you think of a place in the world, any other country in the world, which would deal with issues of terrorism or the preservation of national security in a purer, cleaner way than the United States has thus far? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine such a place. If you start with the Muslim countries, for example, many of which are dictatorships or oligarchies. If you look at Great Britain, where police powers are greater than they are in the United States. If you look at the countries of continental Europe, where the same is true, Indonesia, it's hard for me to imagine a place that Muslims could point to and say, here in the world, there is less hypocrisy in the enforcement of these laws when you get into the area of national security. Is that a valid notion?
I don't think so. When we talk about Muslims, we're often talking about Muslims, as I said, that this is the only country they know, and so their frame of reference is not what's going on in Egypt or going on in Syria. Their frame of reference is the United States they learned in high school and the United States they know today. So that's one. But the second point is that one can do as some scholars do. They undertake comparative studies between what the Israeli Supreme Court has said about individual rights in light of terrorism, or what the Swedish Supreme Court has said, or New Zealand, or Denmark, or France, or so on. There is a material difference, though, and that is the remarkable power of the remarkable position of leadership that the United States occupies. In fact, I'll go further. If we assume arguendo that Sweden's, let's say, track record is better than the United States in some aspects, I think that when you take the moral position that a country like Sweden plays compared to the United States, whether their track record is better or worse really is irrelevant. What is relevant is whether when we say that democracy really matters when the going gets tough, is whether we really mean it, or we mean it as long as it involves someone else getting hurt, but not us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.